Hi guys, this is a recap of our first lecture on global environmental governance in which we asked 7 questions, more or less. What are international environmental problems? What is global environmental governance? Why are some issues easier to address than others? What is the difference between domestic and international systems? What are the different approaches to addressing global environmental problems? What lessons can we draw from the Fur Seal Treaty? And finally, why should we be pragmatically optimistic? And what does that mean? So in terms of the first question about what are international environmental problems, we have a reading from Ronald Mitchell. And he broke it down by different components. So the international piece gets at cross-border phenomenon. So a problem that crosses one or more international border between two countries. The environmental piece gets at changes in the natural world derived from human activity. The problems piece gets at the perceptual lens that enough human beings have to think that change in the natural world is a problem for it to get the attention of decision makers. So even if it's an impact in the natural world on other species, it's refracted through the lens of human beings. So international environmental problems are cross-border changes by humans that impact the natural world that are perceived by enough human beings as a problem to merit attention. And we recognize that attention is variable. Some issues get attention and others don't, and that's a function of how big the impacts are, how obvious they are, which communities are affected, and so which countries are affected. But notionally, we have a sense of what those international environmental problems are. Now, there could be local problems that get international attention, even if they don't cross borders, because they home to some charismatic species that is locally present but internationally recognized. It could be the same thing with important natural features, landscapes that are of international renown. And international concern can also be mobilized, or information sharing can be mobilized if there are problems that affect the human condition that affect people all around the world, like changes in water quality or changes in air pollution. That's common lived experience of human beings. And so the effects might be local, but because people have some shared experience about dealing with solid waste or air pollution all around the world, that they might become an international issue, at least to share best practices. So that's our basic conception of what international environmental problems are. Global environmental governance gets at this notion of there being transborder problems that are addressed by a myriad of actors. So it's not simply by states, but also by intergovernmental organizations and non-state actors. So global environmental governance is collective problem-solving efforts by all of these actors to try to come to grips with these transborder problems derived from human activity that affect the natural world. Now, some issues are easier to resolve than others, and Ronald Mitchell identifies a first cut at ways to think about how to classify issues to think about how easy or hard they are to resolve. And we talk about this in terms of the problem structure. Some issues are benign, some issues are malign. So how do we think about classifying problem types to think about what is this a case of, almost as if we're medical doctors doing a differential diagnosis on our patient, which is the planet or some locale on the planet. And this is a first cut from Ronald Mitchell. Next week, when we talk about public goods and some game metaphors, we'll do this in more detail with additional ideas. But the ones that he came up with are pretty interesting. One of them is about upstream, downstream issues. And what that means is there's either a literal airstream or a river stream that connects two countries. And in that instance, the perpetrator of the pollution is different than the victim. And so in that instance, because they're different, the perpetrator, the upstream actor, isn't all that concerned about addressing the problem, whereas the downstream actor is. But they are motivated to address it, but the person who's creating the problem isn't. So how do you compel them to change their behavior? How do you induce them to change their behavior? And as we'll talk about in a little bit, when we think about the difference between domestic and international systems, that can be fraught. So the downstream actor has to maybe link it to some other issue that they maybe exercise coercive power over through trade, or if they're more militarily powerful as a downstream actor, that might be one way, or they might simply have to pay them off. So that downstream actor might have to compensate the upstream actor and say, stop contaminating my environment. Commons issues are a little different. Commons reflects sort of commonly used and owned resources like fisheries or rangelands. And in those instances, the upstream, instead of it being an upstream and downstream actor where the perpetrator and victim are different, in the common situation, the perpetrator is also a victim. So the actor that's extracting benefit from the resource is also affected by degradation and deterioration in that resource. And so in that setting of the commons, the perpetrators have mixed motives because they are also victims. And so from Mitchell's perspective, that makes those commons type issues a little bit easier to resolve because the perpetrator is also a victim, so has an incentive to clean up their act. As we go through this differential diagnosis, we can also think about other kinds of issues, like, is the problem a capacity problem? And this is the third category he introduces, which is perhaps the reasons for the poor environmental performance. And these categories aren't always mutually exclusive, but let's say that this particular problem is not a function of the willingness of an actor to address their environmental harm, but it's a function of their limited capacity to address the harm. And that capacity could be financial, or it could be about lack of technical skills. But if we determine that the problem is a function of capacity, that's a fixable problem on some level. So with enough resources or training, you can overcome the capacity constraints. And so as we go through this differential diagnosis and we say, why is this happening? If we discover it's a function of the limited capacity of the actor or actors involved, we could address that. He also discusses some other categories of problems like over-appropriation problems. And that means the resources being depleted faster than it can replace itself. So there's overfishing or excessive deforestation. So the fish are being taken out of the fishery faster than they can replace themselves. And the remedy in those situations is mostly going to be to cut back on the harmful activity. And that can be really challenging given the vested interests of the actors involved. They may realize too late that their actions are having a deleterious impact on the recovery of the resource in that situation. He contrasts this a little bit with what he calls degradation problems, in which not the quantity of the resource is affected. In that instance of degradation problems, it's the quality of the resource that's being affected. So it's the same amount of water is being taken out of the system as the quantity that's returned, but it's returned in an inferior state. And so the quality of the resource is degraded. And in those instances, if you can change the process by which you are using the resource to make it less harmful to the in terms of its impacts on the environment, then you can continue to use the resource as before. So process improvements, maybe scrubbers or other ways of taking the pollutants out of the water or air could allow you to continue to use the resource without there being an environmental harm. And that maybe make the solution easier to resolve. He also identifies another category, which is maybe more theoretically challenging to think about, but they're just accidents that happen. And we might think about structurally, are some systems primed for catastrophic accidents and be prepared for that. So that gets at this set of first cut ways of classifying issues into different kinds. Not all of them are mutually exclusive, but it helps us to try to think about, what is this a case of? Why did this happen? Now, one other thing that I alluded to earlier is that there is a difference between domestic and international systems. So in domestic systems, when you have an environmental problem, it's not true for all states in the international system, but many countries have adequate legal rules that can be enforced by courts and police systems. So if someone breaks an environmental rule, you can, in theory, fine them or even jail the people responsible for that problem. In international systems, there's limited enforcement capabilities. Not zero, but it's limited because there's no overarching world government. States are sovereign. They have, in theory, the exclusive right to control what happens inside their borders. In the international system, the ability of international actors to enforce international rules around the environment are limited. Again, it's not zero, but they're more limited. And so that should shape the kinds of strategies that we put in place to try to address these problems. So as we think about different approaches to try to address global environmental problems, the familiar one in the environmental setting are internationally legally binding treaties. And those have been very popular. They have increased dramatically in the wake of World War II. They've diversified in terms of subject matter from ones that were early on, mostly bilateral agreements between countries over fisheries and maybe some wildlife conservation issues, increasingly including more partners and more issue areas, those that had to deal with air pollution and atmospheric pollution like ozone and climate change. Those peaked in the early 2000s and have subsequently declined in terms of the number of new treaties. So they've been very popular in the global environmental space, but it raises the question about, since there are hardly any new treaties being developed, is this the right and only way to approach these problems? And as I noted in class, in the global health space, there are very few treaties. So why is that? Why do you get so many treaties in the environmental space relative to the global health space? And we'll try to think more about that in a few weeks' time when we have a day on international environmental agreements. But the point of thinking about different approaches is that there are other ways to address global environmental problems. There are treaties, but there are also non-binding political agreements. And then there are also forms of private governance. So there are private standard setting groups over paper and pulp products like the Forest Stewardship Council, or for fisheries like the Marine Stewardship Council. And then there are a variety of sort of public-private efforts of both non-state actors and governmental actors trying to come together to establish rules in this space. And so what I hope to encourage us to think about is that there isn't simply one way to address global environmental problems, and not to treat every problem as if the same instruments should be used. And indeed, it may be increasingly challenging in the world that we live in now for us to be able to use the tool of treaty-based mechanisms. And we'll talk more about that later in the semester. The last thing I'd say is that we should be pragmatically optimistic. And this is an idea that comes out of Hannah Ritchie's book, Not the End of the World. And basically the argument she's making is that we now have, with the technologies available to us, a way to de-link improvements in human well-being from environmental impact. And historically, humanity has made great strides through technologies like vaccines in reducing impacts in the health space, for example, to prevent childhood deaths, to extend life expectancy. And we should expect with the technologies that are available to us in the environmental space that if we do things differently, we can dramatically reduce human impact on the natural world and improve human well-being. And for that, we need to be urgently and pragmatically optimistic. We need to take advantage of the opportunities that technologies allow us to use resources more efficiently and effectively, but also continue to have aspirations for improving human well-being. And in so doing, she argues vigorously against some of the arguments that are out there about population control or degrowth. She thinks both of those policy positions are both immoral and politically unwise. And the former, it would require killing hundreds of millions, if not billions of people to reduce their environmental impact, which she thinks would be immoral, and that previous efforts like China's one-child policy were catastrophically immoral and counterproductive in their strategies when the same ends of reducing population could be achieved through other means, such as women's empowerment to have more control over their reproductive choices. In terms of degrowth, she just makes the bet that technologies will allow us to reduce human impact on the environment through more efficient use of resources. And she ultimately thinks it's a political loser to try to focus on degrowth as a winning environmental position in this discussion. So that's my recap of our first lecture on what are global environmental problems. I look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks' time when we talk about public goods theories and theories of cooperation, and I'll see you then. Thanks so much. Bye-bye. I wanted to do a quick follow-up video because there was one question I didn't address in my first one, which was about Scott Barrett's reading on the lessons of the fur seal case. If you recall, in that reading, the U.S. had acquired Alaska and come to control some islands where there were home of fur seal populations. And the U.S. having exclusive control over those islands allowed it to manage those populations, except when they migrated away from the islands and swam in international waters where they were vulnerable to pelagic sealing, which had being hunted at sea, which had the unfortunate effect of other countries seeking to hunt those seals in the water, which was incredibly wasteful and ended up killing pregnant females, ultimately causing population crashes. And so what the U.S. did initially was to try to militarily board and stop boats from Canada, which was a move that Canada and Great Britain resisted mightily. And then there were other countries like Russia and Japan that had sealing interests as well. And so the end result of this was a treaty that banned pelagic sealing, that concentrated the hunt on U.S. territory, but that the U.S. then paid off other countries that had an interest in sealing so that they felt satisfied by the outcome of the agreement. And so the lessons from this agreement in Scott Barrett's mind you, who is an economist, who has a particular approach to thinking about problem solving, is you have to make all the countries better off. So you have to have an aggregate gain where all countries are better off. And secondarily, you need to distribute that gain in a way that all the countries individually feel like they're better off being part of the agreement than not being part of it. And that you want to, make it clear that if they withdraw from the agreement, all the benefits they get from the agreement would fall apart, and that you need to have incentives for countries to comply with the agreement, like monitoring, so that those countries are responsible for preventing their vessels from illegally carrying out sealing at sea. And then finally, there needs to be a way to deter third parties, other countries that aren't part of the agreement, from getting in on the action. And there were some idiosyncrasies of how London controlled the market for seal fur that made it possible to do that in this case. But the upshot of this is to try to think about this for other cases is, can you make all the countries better off? Can you make them individually better off and collectively everybody better off? Can you make sure the agreement fall apart if people withdraw from it, that there are incentives to obey it, and that you can prevent other actors from trying to get in and ruin the agreement for those that are party to it? And it's a helpful, stylized way to think about problem solving in this issue space. And it may not travel to other problem areas. There may not be an aggregate gain that can be distributed to all parties. And so we should be mindful that there may be limits of this. And it may not speak to all the realm of ways in which humans think about the natural world. So, one of the big things that happened since the late 19th century is that people's options of how to clothe themselves changed, but also their attachments and identification about these mammals moved from ones of utility to maybe thinking about them as moral beings worthy of protection, independent of how useful they are to humans. So I hope you find the Barrett reading interesting and intriguing, and a way to think about problem solving in this space. But it may have its limits. He approaches this as an economist, and so it has some idiosyncrasies. But thanks for that follow-on, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.